Jamaica just ended 50 years of IMF dependence, and the world is watching what happens next. In this video, we are going to look at Jamaica's financial independence milestone, a moment that closes half a century of IMF oversight. We'll travel back to 2013 when debt to GDP soared to crisis levels, forcing the nation into another IMF program. We'll explore the painful austerity measures imposed, the struggles of ordinary families, and the surprising turnaround that led to 20 consecutive quarters of growth. And now, in 2025, Jamaica stands on the verge of full repayment. But freedom is only the beginning. We'll uncover the opportunities, challenges, and risks of this new era of sovereignty. The year is 2025, and Jamaica is preparing to close one of the most dramatic chapters in its modern history. For decades, this small but influential Caribbean nation lived under the shadow of the International Monetary Fund, better known as the IMF. The relationship was complicated, sometimes a lifeline, sometimes a shackle. The IMF helped Jamaica avoid collapse during moments of crisis, but its programs also came with conditions so strict that they reshaped the daily lives of millions of Jamaicans. And now, after half a century of dependence, Jamaica is finally about to break free. To appreciate just how historic this moment is, we need to go back to the beginning, to those desperate years when Jamaica had no other choice but to call on the IMF. Imagine the economy of a country sinking under a mountain of debt so high that it seemed impossible to climb out. By the early 2010s, this was Jamaica's reality. Government borrowing had spiraled beyond control, investors lost confidence, and international markets shut their doors. By 2013, Jamaica's debt-to-GDP ratio had exploded to around 146%. Think about that for a second. The country owed nearly 1.5 times the value of everything it produced in an entire year. It was as if every Jamaican family had taken out a loan larger than their annual income, with interest piling up daily. The situation was dire. That year, Jamaica struck a deal with the IMF that would shape the country's destiny for more than a decade. It was called the Extended Fund Facility, or EFF. Under this arrangement, Jamaica gained access to over 615 million SDRs, which translates to about $932 million US. The first slice, $27 million, was released in May 2013. But as anyone familiar with the IMF knows, this money was never a gift. Came with ironclad conditions, and Jamaica had to prove itself worthy of every single tranche. To unlock funding, the government had to commit to radical reforms, maintaining high primary surpluses, restructuring state enterprises, reforming the tax system, and freezing public sector wages. These measures were deeply unpopular. Ordinary Jamaicans felt the squeeze as wage growth stagnated, taxes climbed, and government spending tightened. Families struggled, businesses adjusted, and the promise of short-term relief often looked like long-term pain. Yet, there was no other option. Without IMF support, Jamaica risked total financial collapse. Now let's pause for a moment. The IMF itself is not an ordinary lender. Born out of World War II, its mission is to stabilize economies that can't meet their international obligations or face currency meltdowns. Unlike development banks that finance highways, hospitals, or schools, the IMF focuses on short to medium-term loans that are meant to restore stability. But there's always a trade-off. Every dollar lent comes tied with policy reforms. And these reforms can reach into every corner of a society: taxes, wages, spending priorities, and even how a government manages its enterprises. For Jamaica, IMF loans meant discipline but also dependency. To get money, you had to live under supervision. Every quarter, IMF representatives would review the country's progress and decide whether it deserved the next payout. It was accountability on a global stage, and for years it shaped Jamaica's destiny. By 2016, however, something remarkable was happening. Against all odds, Jamaica was showing progress. Painful reforms were working. The economy was stabilizing, and the IMF recognized the shift. That year, Jamaica transitioned to a new arrangement, a precautionary standby arrangement worth about $1.6 billion. But here's the key difference. Jamaica didn't actually draw down the funds. Instead, this acted like an insurance policy. The money was there if Jamaica faced an external shock, but the fact that it wasn't needed proved something much bigger. Confidence was returning. For the first time in years, Jamaica was standing more firmly on its feet. What followed was a stretch of stability the country had rarely seen before. Between late 2015 and 2019, Jamaica recorded 20 consecutive quarters of economic growth. That's 5 full years of uninterrupted expansion, the longest streak since the country began tracking such data back in 1997. Before that, the best Jamaica had managed was just 9 quarters before sliding back into decline. This time, the story was different. Painful reforms created breathing room, and the government kept its focus. Of course, life for ordinary people was still challenging. Wage freezes, tighter budgets, and rising taxes were heavy burdens. But beneath the frustration, a quiet transformation was underway. Let's talk about how IMF loans work, because this is crucial to understanding why Jamaica's journey was so difficult. When a country borrows from the IMF, it doesn't get the kind of flexible repayment terms you'd expect from a long-term development loan. Instead, repayments, known as repurchases, start just 3 to 5 years after the money is disbursed. That means Jamaica had to begin paying back while it was still struggling. Add on service fees and interest charges, and the pressure mounted quickly. In the early years after 2013, Jamaica's government was paying hundreds of millions annually just to stay current. Falling behind wasn't an option. Default would have shattered confidence and blocked access to markets entirely. So the country stuck with it. Year after year, successive governments maintained high primary surpluses, meaning they collected more in revenue than they spent, excluding interest payments. That discipline kept Jamaica on track, but it also meant painful sacrifices. Schools, hospitals, pensions all felt the pinch. Now, fast forward to 2025. After more than a decade of grit, sacrifice, and discipline, the results are astonishing. At the end of June 2025, IMF records show Jamaica owed just 21.24 million SDRs, roughly $28 million US. To put that into perspective, compare it to the nearly $1 billion borrowed under earlier programs. It's like owing a mountain yesterday and just a pebble today. This is not just progress, it's historic. Jamaica is now on the verge of fully repaying the IMF, ending decades of dependency and ushering in a new era of sovereignty over its own finances. But what does this really mean? For the first time in living memory, Jamaica will no longer have IMF officials peering over its shoulder, dictating how much it must cut, where it must reform, or how it should prioritize its spending. For decades, Jamaica lived under IMF oversight. Every program came with quarterly reviews, public reports, and a checklist of reforms. Passing IMF tests was essential, not just to keep the money flowing, but also to reassure other lenders that Jamaica was a reliable borrower. The IMF's seal of approval acted as a passport to international markets. Without it, Jamaica would have been shut out. Now, with the balance approaching zero, that constant supervision is ending. Jamaica will finally be free to chart its own course. Of course, freedom comes with responsibility. The end of IMF debt doesn't mean Jamaica can spend recklessly. The lessons of the past decade are clear. Fiscal discipline must remain. But what's changing is the sense of sovereignty. Instead of crafting policies just to meet IMF benchmarks, Jamaica can design its fiscal strategies based on national priorities. More of the national budget can be directed toward education, healthcare, pensions, and social security. The money that once went to interest payments can now build schools, fund hospitals, or support small businesses. This is the promise of independence. And yet, we must not forget the human side of this story. Behind the statistics are millions of ordinary Jamaicans who endured the sacrifices. Public workers who lived through wage freezes, families who paid higher taxes, and citizens who saw public services tightened. Their struggles built the foundation for this moment. And so, Jamaica's approaching freedom from the IMF is not just about numbers, it's about dignity. It's about proving that even a small nation, battered by global forces, can claw its way back with determination and discipline. As we move into the second half of this story, we'll dive deeper into what this independence truly means. How will Jamaica use its newfound freedom? What opportunities does this create for future growth, and what risks still remain? The end of IMF control is not the end of the story, it's just the beginning of a new chapter. And the choices made now will determine whether the hard sacrifices of the past decade pay off in a brighter future. Jamaica's long repayment journey, from nearly $1 billion owed in 2013 to under $30 million in 2025, is nothing short of a financial comeback story. But history teaches us that repaying debt is not the end of the road, it's the beginning of new responsibilities. For Jamaica, this is the moment when sovereignty over economic policy is restored. No more quarterly IMF reviews, no more external dictates on how to balance the budget. But the question that now hangs in the air is, what comes next? To understand the gravity of this shift, we have to remember how deep IMF involvement once went. Every major fiscal decision in Jamaica during the last decade and a half was framed within IMF agreements. Wage freezes weren't merely government decisions, they were conditions. Tax reforms weren't simply domestic policy, they were IMF requirements. Even the size of Jamaica's budget surplus was monitored and mandated. Without IMF approval, Jamaica couldn't reassure other lenders, and without those reassurances, the doors to international credit markets stayed locked. It was a cycle of dependency where sovereignty was traded for survival. Now, in 2025, that cycle has finally been broken. The first big opportunity this creates is budgetary freedom. Imagine Jamaica's annual budget as a pie. For years, a massive slice of that pie went straight to debt service, interest payments, IMF obligations, and repayments to other creditors. What was left for schools, hospitals, infrastructure, or pensions was small and shrinking. But with IMF loans nearly gone, the size of the debt service slice is dramatically reduced. Suddenly, there's more pie to share with the people. The government can invest in critical areas like healthcare, where shortages of equipment and staff have long strained the system. Can direct more funds into education, ensuring that Jamaican youth have the skills to compete in a fast-changing global economy. Can expand pensions and social support programs that were previously constrained by IMF-imposed austerity. In short, the financial breathing room that once seemed impossible is now within reach. But independence also raises a challenge: how to maintain discipline without external enforcement. For over a decade, IMF oversight acted like a watchdog, making sure governments stuck to the rules. Without that external pressure, will Jamaica's political leaders maintain the same level of responsibility? This is where history offers cautionary tales. Many countries, after exiting IMF programs, slipped back into old habits, borrowing heavily, spending recklessly, and eventually returning to the fund in another crisis. For Jamaica, avoiding that fate requires institutional strength. Fiscal responsibility must now be self-imposed, not externally mandated. The government will need to adopt long-term frameworks, such as fiscal rules written into law, to ensure future leaders cannot undo the progress achieved with so much sacrifice. Let's not forget the global context either. The world of 2025 is more unpredictable than ever. Interest rates are fluctuating, global energy prices remain volatile, and the ripple effects of geopolitical conflicts are felt everywhere, from food imports to tourism revenues. Jamaica, as a small island economy, remains vulnerable to external shocks it cannot control. Hurricanes, climate change, fluctuations in remittances, and sudden drops in tourism arrivals can all throw budgets into chaos. Without IMF insurance, Jamaica must now build its own resilience. That means boosting foreign exchange reserves, diversifying exports, and expanding industries beyond tourism and bauxite. Freedom comes with exposure, and the ability to withstand shocks will be the true test of this new era. Now let's zoom out and talk about what this means for ordinary Jamaicans. For years, IMF-driven austerity shaped everyday life. Teachers went years without raises. Nurses and doctors struggled in underfunded hospitals. Small businesses faced higher taxes and lower demand as households tightened their belts. These sacrifices were real and they left scars. Now the promise of independence is that life can improve, not overnight but gradually as resources shift from debt service to development. More funds for healthcare could mean shorter waiting times in hospitals, better access to medicines, and improved rural clinics. Increased investment in education could mean modern classrooms, updated curricula, and scholarships for students who once saw higher education as out of reach. Expanded pensions and social safety nets could mean dignity for the elderly and security for the most vulnerable. The repayment milestone is not just about numbers, it's about quality of life. And Jamaicans are ready to see the dividends of their sacrifices. But there's another dimension to this story, one that is less about economics and more about identity. For decades, many Jamaicans felt that IMF supervision was a form of external control, almost a continuation of colonial-era dependency. Every quarterly review felt like a foreign power grading Jamaica's homework. Every reform checklist felt like a set of instructions handed down from outside. Breaking free from the IMF carries enormous symbolic power. It is about sovereignty, pride, and self-determination. It is the ability to say, we can stand on our own, design our own policies, and choose our own future. This symbolic victory resonates not just within Jamaica, but across the Caribbean and beyond. Small nations everywhere watch and take note. If Jamaica can endure the hardship of reform and emerge independent, so can others. Let's not ignore the risks, though. Debt freedom can create a dangerous sense of comfort. Politicians may be tempted to borrow again, this time without the IMF looking over their shoulder. Interest groups may demand higher spending, fueled by the perception that the hard times are over. Discipline weakens, debt can spiral again, undoing years of sacrifice. The challenge for Jamaica is to strike a balance, using its new freedom to invest in people and development but without returning to the reckless borrowing of the past. This is where leadership becomes critical. The decisions made in the next 5 to 10 years will determine whether Jamaica's hard-fought independence becomes a foundation for prosperity or a brief pause before another crisis. Another important aspect is investment. With IMF supervision gone, international investors will watch closely to see how Jamaica manages itself. Confidence, once lost, is hard to regain, but once earned, it can attract capital. Jamaica now has the chance to position itself as a reliable, disciplined, and forward-looking economy. If it succeeds, it can draw foreign direct investment into tourism, manufacturing, renewable energy, and digital services. This could create jobs, expand industries, and further reduce dependence on borrowing. But if fiscal discipline falters, investor confidence could quickly evaporate, making it harder to raise funds even for legitimate development projects. And here's a broader question. What does Jamaica's independence from the IMF mean for the Caribbean as a whole? Many nations in the region face similar challenges: high debt, vulnerability to shocks, and reliance on external financing. Jamaica demonstrates that it can sustain discipline and grow without IMF supervision. It may inspire a regional movement towards self-reliance. Other Caribbean states may pursue stronger fiscal frameworks, diversify their economies, and aim to reduce dependency on external lenders. In this sense, Jamaica's story is bigger than Jamaica. It could mark the beginning of a new chapter for the region. Now, let's take a step back and reflect on the journey itself. Think about it. In 2013, most observers doubted Jamaica could succeed. International headlines described the debt as unsustainable, the reforms as impossible, and the political discipline as unlikely. Yet, 12 years later, Jamaica has done what many thought it could not. It endured the pain, stuck to the plan, and clawed its way out of IMF dependency. That is not just an economic achievement, it is a story of resilience. Proves that even small nations, often dismissed as weak or fragile, can rise with determination and discipline. And it proves that the sacrifices of ordinary citizens, though heavy, were not in vain. So what comes next? The future will depend on how Jamaica uses its newfound freedom. Will the government invest in climate resilience, preparing the island for stronger hurricanes and rising sea levels? Will it expand digital infrastructure, connecting Jamaican youth to the opportunities of the global economy? Will it reform the education system to match the needs of modern industries? Will it strengthen healthcare so that the nation can face future pandemics or health crises with confidence? These are the choices that now lie in Jamaica's hands, choices that will define the next chapter of its story. Jamaica's release from IMF control is more than a financial milestone. It is a story of sovereignty, resilience, and identity. For decades, IMF programs shaped every budget decision, wage freeze, and tax reform. Now that external oversight is gone. But with freedom comes responsibility. The government must resist reckless borrowing and instead invest wisely in education, healthcare, climate resilience, and opportunities for its people. Ordinary Jamaicans who endured the sacrifices deserve the dividends of independence. The challenge now is to use that freedom wisely, to build an economy that serves its people, strengthens its resilience, and ensures that the sacrifices of the past decade lay the foundation for a brighter, more prosperous future. So as we look to the horizon, one thing is clear: Jamaica has turned the page. The IMF is no longer in control. The next chapter belongs to Jamaicans themselves. And if history is any guide, this chapter has the potential to be the most powerful one yet. The world is watching. Will Jamaica seize this moment? If you found this powerful story inspiring, subscribe to our channel for more groundbreaking updates.